Before we get into the video, could everyone please subscribe to my HOA Karen Tales channel? Thank you so much. It was a peaceful morning in the countryside, the kind where the air was crisp and the sky held a soft golden hue. As the sun peeked over the horizon, birds chirped, a gentle breeze rustled through the trees, and everything was perfect until I fired up my tractor. The deep rumbling roar of the engine shattered the morning silence as I got to work tilling my fields and preparing for the new planting season. I had been doing this for years, and my farm was my pride and livelihood. But today, I was about to meet the one person who considered my tractor her worst nightmare. Karen stormed onto my property like a hurricane in human form. She was still in her robe and slippers, her hair a tangled mess, and her face twisted in the kind of outrage usually reserved for the discovery of a deep betrayal. Her hands flailed as she marched toward me, and even over the roar of my tractor, I could hear her yelling. I sighed, slowed the machine, and hopped off, already bracing for whatever nonsense was about to spill from her mouth. "Do you have any idea what time it is?" she shrieked, her voice hitting a pitch that made me wonder if she had a hidden career as a dog whistle. "People are trying to sleep. You can't just fire up that monstrosity and wake the entire neighborhood." I wiped the sweat from my forehead and stared at her, half amused and half annoyed. "Karen, it's 7 in the morning. Farmers work early. This is normal." "Normal?" she scoffed, crossing her arms so tightly that I was surprised her circulation wasn't cut off. "Normal for who? Cavemen? Civilized people don't wake up to the sound of an earthquake every morning. I'm going to report you to the HOA." I almost laughed. "We don't have an HOA, Karen. We live in the countryside. You moved here, remember? This is farm country. You don't get to complain about farm noises." She spun around, looking like she had been personally insulted. "Well, I'll call the police then. There must be noise ordinances against this." I pulled off my gloves, sighing. "Go ahead. They'll tell you the same thing I am. I'm allowed to work my land, and I'm doing it at a reasonable hour." She glared at me, her eyes narrowed into slits. "We'll see about that," she snapped before spinning on her heel and storming back toward her pristine house. I shook my head, climbing back onto my tractor, assuming this would be the end of it. But I had underestimated Karen's determination to make my life miserable. That evening, just as I was settling down with a cold drink after a long day, my phone rang. It was the local sheriff's office. The officer on the line was someone I knew well, having grown up in this town. His tone was more amused than concerned. "Hey, buddy, we got a noise complaint from your neighbor," he said, barely holding back a chuckle. "Apparently, your tractor is causing unbearable distress and making it impossible for her to function in daily life." I groaned. "You're kidding." "Nope." She insisted we do something about it, and we told her there's nothing illegal about you working your farm at 7 in the morning. But she's threatening to escalate it. She mentioned something about taking it to the county board. I pinched the bridge of my nose. "Of course, she's just giving you a heads up," he said. "I wouldn't worry about it, but knowing Karen, she's not going to let this go." I thanked him and hung up, already feeling the irritation creeping in. Karen had moved out here from the city less than a year ago, buying up one of the newly built houses that sat on the outskirts of actual farmland. She had complained about everything since the day she arrived. The smell of manure, the sight of tractors, the occasional cow wandering too close to her property. But this was a whole new level of ridiculous. I sat on my porch, thinking if she wanted to play this game, I could play too. I pulled up the local noise ordinances on my phone, reading through them carefully, and there was in clear legal text. Farm equipment could be operated starting at 5 a.m. A slow grin spread across my face. If she thought 7 a.m. was bad, I was about to give her a real wake-up call. That night, I set my alarms extra early. I prepped my tractor, making sure it was in perfect working order, and at exactly 5 a.m., while the stars were still fading from the sky, I climbed onto my machine, took a deep breath, and turned the key. The engine roared to life, louder than ever in the early morning silence. The sound echoed across the land, breaking the peaceful stillness like a bomb going off. Lights flicked on in Karen's house almost immediately. I revved the engine a few times for good measure, pretending to adjust something in the controls, and then, As expected, she came bursting out of her front door, this time in full-blown rage mode. She wasn't just angry. She was unhinged, flailing her arms and screaming something incoherent. I waved cheerfully, pretending not to hear her over the tractor. She stomped toward me, but I was already moving. The plow dug into the ground, and I started working, ignoring her as she continued her tantrum. She probably thought I was being rude, but in reality, I was just enjoying the moment. This was farm life. This was what she signed up for when she decided to live out here. And if she couldn't handle it, that wasn't my problem. The next few minutes were glorious. Karen tried calling me over, but I simply kept working. She finally gave up and stormed back in her house, slamming the door so hard that I was sure she had rattled her own windows. I continued working, the satisfaction settling in. This was just the beginning. If Karen wanted a battle over noise, she was about to find out that farmers don't lose when it comes to early mornings. Karen's failure to get the police or the homeowners association to stop me only fueled her determination. I could tell she was plotting something because every time she saw me, she'd shoot me a glare so intense it could probably curdle milk. I kept up my usual routine, starting work at 5 a.m. Each morning, without fail, her bedroom light would flick on like a distress signal. She no longer stormed outside to scream at me, but I could feel her seething from behind her windows. It didn't take long for her next move to make itself known. I came home one evening to find another official-looking letter in my mailbox, this time from the county board. Karen had somehow managed to file a formal complaint claiming my farm was a public nuisance. The letter stated that I had to attend a hearing to defend my right to operate my equipment during the legally allowed hours. I couldn't believe it. She was actually dragging me into a legal battle over the sound of a tractor. I wasn't worried about losing, but I was annoyed. It was a waste of my time and an obvious attempt to inconvenience me. The hearing was set for the following week, so in the meantime, I went about my business as usual. The difference now was that Karen had ramped up her campaign to turn the entire neighborhood against me. She started knocking on doors again, trying to convince people to sign yet another petition, this time asking the county to place strict noise restrictions on farm equipment. But she must have underestimated how much people disliked her, because not only did no one sign it, but some of my neighbors started actively messing with her. One guy told her he'd sign it if she agreed to stop complaining about everything. Another neighbor offered to start mowing his lawn at 4 a.m. just to give her something else to be mad about. It was becoming clear that Karen had overplayed her hand. Still, she wasn't done. Since she couldn't win over the neighbors, she decided to target my farm in a different way. One evening, as I was finishing up work, I noticed a group of people walking through my fields with clipboards. I went over to investigate and was greeted by a woman who introduced herself as an inspector from the zoning office. Apparently, Karen had filed another complaint claiming my farm was in violation of multiple zoning laws. I knew right away that this was nonsense, but I played along, answering the inspector's questions and showing her around. She was professional, but visibly irritated at having been sent out for what was clearly a bogus complaint. After about an hour, she confirmed that everything was in order and that I wasn't breaking any regulations. She even admitted that this wasn't the first time she dealt with Karen's antics. The next morning, at exactly 5 a.m., I started my tractor with a little extra enthusiasm. The engine's roar filled the air, and sure enough, Karen's light flicked on. I imagined her grinding her teeth in frustration as she realized all her efforts had amounted to nothing. But Karen wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully. A few days later, she tried a new approach: emotional manipulation. She went on the neighborhood online forum and posted a long-winded rant about how my tractor was ruining her mental health. She claimed that she hadn't had a good night's sleep in weeks, and that the noise was driving her to the brink of collapse. She even threw in a dramatic statement about how she was considering selling her house because she couldn't take it anymore. The replies were brutal. Instead of rallying behind her, the neighborhood roasted her mercilessly. People pointed out that she had chosen to move next to a farm. Others reminded her that she had spent months complaining about everything from barking dogs to the smell of fresh manure. Someone even posted a meme of a crying woman labeled Karen with the caption, "Moves next to a farm, complains about farm noises." It was clear that whatever sympathy she might have hoped for had backfired spectacularly. Karen tried to push back, arguing that no one should have to wake up to that kind of noise, but at that point, people were just laughing at her. Even those who might have initially found my early morning tractor work annoying had turned against her because of how relentless and over the top she had been. She deleted her original post within hours, but by then, the damage had been done. Still, she wasn't done scheming. Late one night, I caught her sneaking around my property again. This time, she was carrying what looked like a roll of caution tape. I stayed hidden, watching as she stretched the tape across the entrance to my farm, as if trying to make it look like some kind of restricted area. She then took out her phone and started snapping pictures, probably planning to use them as evidence in another one of her complaints. I let her finish before stepping out and clear my throat. Karen jumped like she had been caught committing a federal crime. She turned to face me, her expression shifting from shock to an awkward attempt at feigned innocence. "What exactly are you doing, Karen?" I asked, arms crossed. She straightened her posture and huffed. "I have every right to document this situation. People need to see how disruptive your farm is." I gestured to the caution tape. "And this? What are you trying to make it look like? My farm is condemned." She faltered for a moment before regaining her composure. "I was just emphasizing the hazard." I shook my head. "Karen, go home." She stood there for a moment, clearly trying to think of some excuse to justify her behavior, but ultimately, she turned and stomped away. I watched her go, half expecting her to throw one last insult over her shoulder, but she stayed silent. Maybe even she knew she had gone too far this time. The next day, I woke up to find an anonymous note taped to my mailbox in messy, angry handwriting. It read, "This isn't over." I didn't need a signature to know exactly who had written it. At this point, Karen had lost every possible battle. The police weren't on her side. The HOA and county board had ruled in my favor, and the neighborhood had turned against her. But instead of backing down, she was now resorting to petty vandalism and intimidation tactics. I decided it was time to go on the offensive. I've been playing nice, just setting her up to embarrass herself. But if she wanted to keep escalating, I was more than happy to meet her at her level. That evening, I made a few modifications to my tractor. If Karen thought the noise was bad before, she had no idea what was coming next. The sun was barely peeking over the horizon when I started my tractor at exactly 5 a.m. The engine roared to life, breaking the silence of the morning with a deep rumbling growl. I had never enjoyed the sound more. As expected, it took less than 5 minutes for the first signs of Karen's impending meltdown to appear. Her bedroom light clicked on, followed quickly by the furious flinging open of her curtains. Even from a distance, I could see her wild silhouette standing there like some kind of horror movie villain who had just discovered their latest grievance. I didn't slow down. I made a show of adjusting my seat, double-checking the controls, and then revving the engine a few more times just to make sure everything was running smoothly. The roar echoed through the open land, bouncing off Karen's house in the most satisfying way possible. I had barely started my work when her front door slammed open, and she came storming out in her nightgown, her hair looking like she had fought a losing battle with a tornado. She didn't even bother putting on proper shoes, stomping toward my fence in a pair of fuzzy slippers that looked comically out of place. She started screaming before she even reached me, her voice cutting through the early morning like nails on a chalkboard. I could only catch bits and pieces over the sound of my tractor, but I was pretty sure she was threatening to have me arrested, fined, or possibly exiled from the neighborhood entirely. I gave her a polite wave as if I had no idea why she was so worked up and kept on working, plowing through the soil like I had no care in the world. Karen wasn't the type to give up easily. When screaming didn't work, she pulled out her phone, jabbing at the screen with a level of aggression that suggested she was either calling the police or writing the most furious HOA complaint in history. By the way, I didn't care. I had checked the laws. I was well within my rights to work at this hour, and if she thought throwing a fit was going to stop me, she had another thing coming. About 10 minutes later, the flashing red and blue lights of a police car appeared at the end of the road. I slowed my tractor and climbed down just as the officer stepped out. To my amusement, It was the same cop who had called me the night before. He looked over at Karen, who was already halfway through a dramatic monologue about how my tractor was destroying the peace and robbing her of her right to sleep. The officer, clearly familiar with her antics, sighed and turned to me instead. "Morning," he said, his tone laced with amusement. "Got another complaint about noise?" I wiped some sweat off my brow and leaned against my tractor. "Well, I do like to start my work early," I said with a shrug. "Farm life, you know." Karen cut in before the officer could respond. "This is harassment. He's doing this on purpose. Nobody needs to start working this early." Her voice was climbing in pitch, her frustration bubbling over. "I'm going to sue. I will take this to the mayor if I have to." The officer gave her a long, tired look before pulling out a small notepad. "I already explained the laws to you yesterday. He's not breaking any rules. He's allowed to start work at 5 a.m. Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish struggling for air. "That's absurd. Who makes these laws? This isn't civilization. This is insanity." "Well, you did move to a farming community," the officer pointed out, his voice carrying the tone of someone who had explained something too many times. She looked like she wanted to argue, but even she knew she wasn't going to win this one. Huffing, she spun on her heel and stormed back into her house, slamming the door behind her hard enough to rattle the windows. The officer gave me a knowing look before shaking his head. "Try not to antagonize her too much," he said, though there was no real seriousness in his tone. I grinned. "I'm just doing my job." He chuckled and headed back to his car, leaving me to my work. I climbed back on my tractor, feeling victorious, but I knew Karen wasn't done. She was the type to escalate things when she didn't get her way, and I had a feeling she was already planning her next move. By the next day, her new tactic became clear. She had contacted the homeowners association, even though it didn't technically have authority over my farm, and demanded they do something about my unbearable disturbance. I received an official-looking letter in the mail warning me about community noise concerns. I couldn't help but laugh. Instead of responding with anger, I sent them back a copy of the county noise ordinances with a note attached that read, "I can legally start at 4 a.m. if you'd prefer." The next time I saw Karen, she looked absolutely livid. I gave her a friendly nod as I started on my tractor. She screamed something I couldn't hear and stomped back inside. It was almost too easy. Karen, however, was not one to give up so easily. A few days later, she started a petition to ban excessive farm noise from the neighborhood. She went door to door, trying to convince people that my tractor was a menace to society. Unfortunately for her, my neighbors had known me for years and were far more irritated with Karen than with my early morning work routine. The petition flopped, with most people either refusing to sign or outright laughing at her. One of my neighbors even decided to have some fun with it. He showed up at my farm at 5 a.m. With a cup of coffee and a lawn chair, I watched the chaos unfold as Karen raged against my existence. Another neighbor jokingly asked if I would start playing music to go along with the tractor noise. "Maybe some yodeling," he suggested with a grin. I laughed but tucked the idea away. Defeated by her failed petition, Karen decided to take things into her own hands. Late one night, she snuck onto my property, clearly intending to do something to my tractor. Unfortunately for her, I had anticipated this. I had set up motion-activated sprinklers around my equipment, and the moment she stepped too close, the water shot out in powerful streams. A scream pierced the night as Karen was drenched from head to toe. I watched from my porch, sipping my drink, as she ran back to her house, slipping once on the wet grass and cursing loudly. The next morning, she posted on the neighborhood forum that she had suffered emotional distress and was considering legal action against me for an unprovoked attack. Nobody took her seriously. I knew Karen wasn't going to give up, but at this point, I was having too much fun. She had turned what could have been a simple disagreement into a full-blown battle, and I wasn't about to let her win. If she thought 5 a.m. was bad, she had no idea what I had planned next. The next morning, I woke up feeling particularly energized. Karen had made it clear she wasn't going to stop, so I figured it was time to have some fun with it. If she wanted to escalate things, I was more than willing to match her level of pettiness. I had spent the previous evening making a few small but effective modifications to my tractor. It still worked the same, but now it had a little extra surprise attached. At exactly 5 a.m., I fired it up just like I had every morning for the past few weeks. But this time, as soon as the engine roared to life, a loud, high-pitched, yodeling song blasted from the speakers I had installed. The exaggerated wailing of an alpine singer echoed through the countryside, bouncing off Karen's house with perfect clarity. I sat back in my seat, grinning as I watched the inevitable reaction unfold. Karen's bedroom light flicked on immediately. Within seconds, her window was thrown open, and her furious half-asleep face appeared. Even over the sound of the music, I could hear her screaming something, though it was mostly drowned out by the yodeling. She disappeared from the window, and I knew she was about to make her usual dramatic entrance. Sure enough, her front door burst open, and she stormed outside, her bathrobe flapping behind her like a cape of rage. She was waving her arms wildly, yelling something about how this was harassment and how she was going to have me arrested for psychological torture. I just gave her a friendly wave and continued my work, acting as if I hadn't noticed her screaming at me from across the yard. She stomped up to the edge of my property, pointing an accusing finger at me. "Turn that off right now. This is a violation of noise laws." "Is this abuse?" Her voice cracked slightly at the end, a clear indication that she was on the verge of completely losing it. I cut the yodeling for a moment and leaned down from my seat. "Karen," I checked the noise ordinances again. "There's no law against playing music on private property." She clenched her fists so tightly that I thought she might actually explode. "You are doing this on purpose. You are targeting me. You're trying to drive me insane." I shrugged. "I'm just making my work more enjoyable. Farming can be lonely, you know? Gotta have some entertainment." She let out a strangled noise that I could only describe as pure frustration, then turned on her heel and stormed back into her house. I knew she wasn't going to give up that easily, so I kept a close eye on her window while I continued working. Sure enough, less than 10 minutes later, I saw her standing in her living room talking to someone on her phone. It didn't take a genius to figure out she was calling the cops again. About 15 minutes later, a patrol car pulled up in front of my property. I shut off the engine and climbed down, trying my best to look innocent. The officer stepped out, and to my delight, it was the same guy who had already been called out here twice before. He looked at me, then at Karen, then back at me with an expression that screamed, "Not this again." Karen wasted no time launching into her tirade. "Officer, this man is harassing me. He's intentionally playing loud music at dawn just to torment me. This is beyond reasonable. This is psychological warfare." The officer said, taking out his notepad, "Sir, are you playing music while working?" I nodded. "Sure am. I like a little background noise while I plow. Helps pass the time." He scribbled something down, then glanced at Karen. "There's no law against playing music outdoors during legal working hours." Karen's jaw practically unhinged. But it's yodeling. Who plays yodeling at 5 in the morning?" The officer gave me an amused look, then turned back to her. There's no law against that." Her face turned bright red, and for a second, I thought she might actually try to physically fight the officer. Instead, she let out a frustrated screech and stomped back into her house, slamming the door so hard that a nearby bird took off from a tree in panic. The officer chuckled. "You really know how to push her buttons, don't you?" I grinned. "She started it." He shook his head, clearly entertained. "Well, no law's broken here. Try not to make her completely lose her mind." "All right. No promises," I said with a wink. He laughed and got back in his patrol car, driving away. As I resumed my work, the rest of the day passed without incident, but I knew Karen wasn't done. She had lost every official battle, so that meant she was going to get desperate. Sure enough, that night, I caught her sneaking around my property again. This time she had a spray can in her hand and was creeping toward my tractor like some kind of cartoon villain. I waited until she got close, then flicked on my floodlights. Lights illuminating the entire field. She froze in place like a deer caught in headlights, her face twisted in a mixture of shock and guilt. "Karen," I called out, arms crossed. "What exactly are you doing?" She hesitated, glancing around as if searching for an escape plan. "I was just, inspecting your tractor for safety violations." I raised an eyebrow. with a can of spray paint. She swallowed hard, clearly realizing she had been caught. I was marking it as evidence. I sighed. Karen, go home. For a moment, she looked like she might try to argue, but then she huffed, threw the spray can down in frustration, and stomped back to her house. I waited until she was inside before picking up the can and tossing it into my shed. If she thought vandalizing my equipment was going to scare me into stopping, she had another thing coming. The next morning, I woke up to a new surprise. Karen had put her house up for sale. There was a big shiny for sale sign planted in her yard, and she was outside talking to a realtor with an expression of barely concealed rage. I couldn't help but laugh. She had officially given up. As I started my tractor that morning, I gave her one final parting gift. I blasted the horn one last time, just for old time's sake. Karen stiffened, clenched her fists, and then, without a word, turned her back on me and stomped inside. I smiled to myself, knowing I had officially won. The morning after Karen put up the for sale sign, I half expected her to have second thoughts. Maybe she would come storming over with some final desperate attempt to make my life miserable. Maybe she would call in one last complaint or try to pull some petty stunt before she left for good. But to my surprise, she stayed inside all morning, ignoring the roar of my tractor. It was almost disappointing. After all the chaos, the arguments, the threats, and the ridiculous antics, it was strange to not see her bursting out of her house, flailing her arms and screaming at me. I went about my morning routine, plowing the fields and enjoying the peace of knowing that the worst was over. The absence of Karen screeching almost made the work feel easier. By the time I took my first break, I noticed a couple of people walking around her property with a real estate agent. I had no idea who they were, but I hoped they were the kind of people who actually appreciated farm life. The last thing I needed was another Karen moving in and starting the whole nightmare all over again. Later that afternoon, I went into town to pick up supplies. While waiting in line at the hardware store, I overheard a couple of locals gossiping about Karen. Apparently, she had already been complaining to the real estate agent about how unlivable the area was because of inconsiderate farmers with their obnoxious machinery. She wasn't even gone yet, and she was still trying to cause problems. The guy behind the counter chuckled when he saw me listening. He knew exactly what I'd been dealing with. "Guess you finally won," he said, ringing up my items. It took a while, but yeah, she's finally leaving. She tried to get the HOA to ban farm equipment. He shook his head, clearly amused by the whole ordeal. She tried to say the whole town should be noise-free before 9 in the morning, like she had any authority over that. I laughed. Sounds about right. By the time I got back home, Karen was outside with her realtor, looking completely miserable. I couldn't resist giving her a friendly wave as I drove past. She glanced but didn't say anything. She looked so tired, defeated, and I knew at that moment that she had realized she had lost. No one in the neighborhood was on her side. The local authorities had laughed her out of every complaint she had filed. The HOA, the county, and even potential buyers weren't taking her seriously. She had dug herself into a hole so deep that the only way out was to pack up and leave. A few days later, the moving truck showed up. I watched from my porch as Karen stomped around, barking orders at the movers. She looked furious about having to leave, but she didn't have much of a choice. I couldn't help but enjoy the sight. She had spent so much time trying to make my life miserable, but in the end, she was the one who had to give up. She was the one who couldn't handle it anymore. It was poetic justice. The best part came when I met the family that had bought her house. They introduced themselves as soon as the moving trucks pulled away. It was a couple with 2 young kids, and to my delight, the husband was an old-school farm enthusiast. He had grown up in a rural town and had been looking for a home near the countryside because he missed the lifestyle. When I asked what he did for a living, he grinned and said he worked in agricultural equipment sales. The irony nearly made me choke on my coffee. Karen had spent months trying to get rid of the sound of my tractor, and now the people moving into her house were literally in the business of selling farm machinery. If she had any idea who was replacing her, she would have lost her mind. Over the next few weeks, the new neighbors settled in nicely. They loved the area, and they never once complained about the tractor noise. In fact, the husband actually came over one morning to admire my equipment. He had a deep appreciation for farming and was genuinely interested in the work I did. We chatted for a while, and by the end of the conversation, he made a passing joke about how he had an old tractor that he was thinking of restoring. He even asked if I'd be interested in some friendly morning tractor races. I almost fell over laughing at the idea. Karen had fought tooth and nail to silence my tractor, and now her old house belonged to a man who wanted to add more of them to the neighborhood. It was poetic in a way that I never could have planned for. For the first time in months, the neighborhood felt peaceful again. Without Karen's constant complaints, things went back to the way they should have been. The air felt lighter. The mornings felt quieter. The sound of my equipment and the people around me were back to their usual friendly selves. No more drama. No more ridiculous accusations. No more threats of legal action. Still, I couldn't help myself from having one last bit of fun before completely closing the chapter on Karen. On the morning after she officially left, I fired up my tractor as usual. The engine roared to life, filling the air with the familiar sound of work beginning. But this time, I didn't stop there. I turned on the speakers one last time and let the sound of yodeling echo through the countryside. The new neighbors, instead of reacting with rage like Karen would have, burst out laughing. The husband gave me a thumbs up from his porch, clearly understanding the joke, even without the full context. I knew then that I had truly won. Karen was gone, and I could finally enjoy my land the way I was meant to. The battle had been long, but in the end, the F always wins.